Jones, and I am deeply honored to be introducing E.L. Doctorow to you tonight. Really, I don't think I should read you his whole list of achievements. We'll be here till 2 o'clock in the morning. But if you don't mind, I'll start with a short anecdote. This is how I think I first really met Edgar and Helen. My mother was very concerned when I was in high school, just out of high school, like first year of college, because we were hanging with these boys from the wrong side of the tracks, and she thought we should meet some nice young men. So she called us from a party in Sag Harbor and said, "Quick, get down here. There's these nice young men. They're going to college. They have a lot of money. Come with your girlfriends." So we get in the car, and of course my mother is well known for her lack of sense of direction is horrendous. So we drive into Sag Harbor as fast as we can. We follow these directions, and we end up at this beautiful house with many, many cars parked out front, and we say, well, this must be it. So we arrive at the party, and it was the Doctorow's house. And this was not where my mother was at all. She was at a totally other party. So I said to my friend, I said, oh my God, I think this is E.L. Doctorow's house. And my friend Elizabeth said, E.L. Doctorow, oh my God. Because at that time he was the most famous writer practically in the world. It was not too long after Ragtime. So I walked over to Helen, to his wife, and I said, "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Doctorow, we're at the wrong party, but I'm Kaylee Jones, I'm Gloria's daughter." And she said, no, please stay and have a good time. So we never met these young men we were supposed to meet, and we ended up hanging with the guys from the wrong side of the tracks, for the rest of the summer. But we had something to talk about. When we were at Edgar and Helen Doctorow's for this party, and that's sort of the first time that I was at their house and really got to know them, and they were so kind to us to let us stay. E.L. Doctorow has, among his honors, the National Book Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award twice, the Penn-Faulkner Award, the Edith Wharton Citation for Fiction, the William Dean Howell Medal of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the presidentially conferred National Humanities Medal. He's born in New York, has lived in New York, and writes a great deal about New York. I will mention some of his novels. What is amazing about Mr. Doctorow is his range. I mean, among other things, he's quite amazing, but his range is truly incredible. His first novel, Welcome to Hard Times, was a Western, in the Western tradition. Big as Life was science fiction. The Book of Daniel, a wonderful novel, was about the Adam trials of the 50s and the execution of this young man, Daniel's parents, and how he goes looking into the past to find out what really happened. Ragtime, which I think the word faction may have even been coined at that time, a book of fiction using fact-based events and people, a huge national bestseller. Loon Lake, wonderful novel. World's Fair, Billy Bathgate, which came out in 1989, and also The Waterworks, which is not on my list, but I put it on because I love that book. City of God, which is his most recent novel, I believe, from 2001. These are among many other things, his body of work, which is truly an extraordinary body of work with a great range. I was looking for this quote today, and I luckily found it. This is from Joan Didion, who says, "Certain places seem to exist mainly because someone has written about them. Kilimanjaro belongs to Ernest Hemingway. Oxford, Mississippi belongs to William Faulkner. A place belongs forever to whoever claims it hardest, remembers it most obsessively, wrenches it from itself, shapes it, renders it, loves it so radically that he remakes it in his image." And I think we can say that this is true of historical New York for Edgar Doctorow, who has captured that place in so many different guises and so beautifully that once his work is read, it cannot be forgotten. So please, ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome E.L. Doctorow.
Thank you. Well, you've all been immersed in the writing life for a week and a half now. Just a couple more laps to go, and then you can climb up onto the edge of the pool and catch your breath. After Kaylee's gracious remarks, I'm going to read a story not about New York at all. This is a story called Baby Wilson. Am I heard all right? Baby Wilson. I had taken up with her knowing she was this crazy, lovesick girl. It was against my better judgment. I was too accustomed to having my life made easy. I was stopped in my tracks by the smitten sweet smile and the pale eyes, with straight brown hair she never fussed with but to wash it, and she wore long cotton dresses and no shoes in the business district. Karen, a whole year ago, and now she had gone and done this thing. She held it out to me all rolled up in a blanket. Where'd you get that? Lester, this is our baby. He is named Jesu because he is a Spanish-looking child. He will be a dark, saturnine young man with slim hips like yours. The face was still red with its effort to be born, and its hair was slick with something like pomade, and it had small dark eyes struggling to see. Around his wrist was a plastic band. I don't want to hold him, I said. Take him back. Oh, silly man, she said, smiling. It's not hard to hold a dear child. No, Karen, I mean take him back to the hospital where you stole him. I couldn't do that, Lester. I couldn't do that. This is my newborn child. This is my tiny little thing his mama loves so that I'm giving him to you to be your son. And she smiled at me, that dreamland smile of hers. She moved her shoulders from side to side and sang to it, but the little arms jerked and waved a bit, and she didn't seem to notice. There was a dried blob of blood on the front of its wrappings. I looked at the clock. It was just noon. Was this a reasonable day? Karen should have been at Nature's Basket doing up her flowers. I went into the bedroom and put on my jeans and a fresh shirt. I wet my hair and combed it and got a beer from the kitchen. There were 2 hospitals in Crenshaw, the private one in the historic district and the county one out by the interstate. What did it matter where she took it from? Either one would be just as good. Or I could drive it direct to the police station, not the smartest idea in the world. Or I could just take the Durango and leave. Instead of doing any of these things by which I would finally reform into a person who makes executive decisions, I thought to myself, I would not want to shock such a woman in her dangerous, blissful state of mind, and so went back and tried again, as if you could argue sense into someone who was never too steady to begin with and was now totally bereft of her remaining faculties. This is wrong, Karen. It is wrong to go around stealing babies. But this is my baby, she said, staring into its face. I mean our baby, Lester, yours and mine. I bore it as you conceived it. I went over to the couch where she had sat down, and I looked again at the wristband. It said, Baby Wilson. My name is not Wilson, and your name is not Wilson, I said. That is a simple clerical error. Jesu is our love child, Lester. He's our indissoluble bond that God has placed upon our union. God commanded this. We can never part now. We are a family. And she looked at me with her pale eyes all a-dazzle. Jesu, if it was him, was crying in little yelps, and its head was turning this way and that with its mouth open, and its little hands were all a-tremor. I had known she would finally put me at risk. I had tried to pay no attention when she stole things and presented them to me because they were little things and of no use. A Mexican embroidered nightshirt, whereas I liked to sleep in the altogether, or a silver money clip in the shape of an L for Lester like I was some downtown lawyer, or an antique music box, for Christ's sake, that plays Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, as if anyone would want to hear it more than once. Totally the wrong thing for me. If it was me she was stealing for, whereas I was hard-pressed to get a decent meal in this household. Karen opened her blouse and put the baby to her breast. It hadn't changed any that I could see. Of course there was no milk there. I sat down next to her and pointed the remote at the TV. Cartoon, a rerun, puppets, a rerun, nature, a preacher, and then I found the local news station. Just like them, they hadn't heard the news yet. Karen, I said, I'll be right back, and I drove into town to the Bluebird. It was lunchtime, busy as hell, and Brenda wasn't too pleased, but seeing the look in my eyes, she took a cigarette break out the back door. I told her what was up. She stood listening, Brenda, and shook her head. Lester, she said, your brains are in your balls. That is the way you are, and that is the way you'll always be. God damn it, Brenda, it's not something I've done, you understand. Is this what I need to hear from you right now? She was squinting at me from the smoke drifting up into her eyes. I said, and you sometimes haven't minded if that's where my brain is, as I recall. Brenda is as unlike Karen as two women can be, sturdier in mind and shaped as if for the Bluebird clientele in her powder blue uniform with Brenda stitched on the bosom pocket. Are you aware, she said, that kidnapping is a federal offense? Are you aware that if something happens to that infant, the both of you, I'm saying the both of you, don't shake your head no, let's see, how do they do it in this state? I forget, electricity or the needle? I mean, all Alice in Wonderland will end up is in the loony bin, but you is aiding and abetting? Goodbye, Charlie. I was beginning to feel sick to my stomach standing there out in the sun with the Bluebird garbage bins in full reek. She ground out her cigarette and took me by the arm and walked me around to the parking lot. Now listen, Lester. The first thing is to go to the Kmart and buy you some infant formula. I believe it comes in their own plastic bottles these days. You follow the instructions and feed that baby so it doesn't die, as it surely will if you don't step in here. And while you're at it, buy you an armload of diapers. They come with Velcro now, and a nightie or three and a cap for its head. She looked up at the sky. It's supposed to get cooler later on. And whatever else you see there in infants and toddlers that might come in useful. You understand me? I nodded. And then, when it turns out you haven't killed that child, you get it back to its rightful parents as soon as you possibly can, any way you can, and see to it that your darling poetess up there on Cloud 9 takes the rap that is justly hers to take. Do you hear me? I nodded. Brenda opened the door for me and saw me up behind the wheel. And Lester, if I don't hear on the TV tonight that you've settled this to a happy conclusion, I personally will call the cops. You understand me? Thanks, Brenda. She slammed the door. And don't ever try to see me anymore, Lester, you asshole, she said. I had done everything Brenda advised by way of food and sanitation, and now there was peace in the house. I didn't want to alarm Karen in any way, so I treated her with nothing but cooperation. By the time I'd gotten back from the store, she had just begun to realize that a baby needed taken care of. She was so grateful she hugged me, and I helped her fuss over that child as if it was truly ours. Isn't he the sweetest thing? How he seems to know us, Karen said. Oh, that is so dear. Look at that sweet face. He's surely the most beautiful baby I've ever seen. Now, with everything calmed down and both Karen and baby Wilson asleep on our bed, it was time to do some thinking. I put on the 5 o'clock news to get the lay of the land. Oh my. The Crenshaw Commissioner of Police saying the entire CPD had been put on alert and deployed throughout the city to find the infant and apprehend the kidnapper or kidnappers. He'd also notified the FBI. Hey, I said, it's just my slightly crazy girl, Karen. You don't have to worry. We're not kidnappers, man. The female they wanted for questioning was probably in her 20s, white, about 5'6", slight of build, with straight brown hair. She had brought a bouquet of flowers and when approached by a nurse claimed to be a friend of Mrs. Wilson's. She was that cool, my Karen? Behind the commissioner was a worried-looking hospital official, and I supposed the nurse in question, tearful now for having turned her back for a moment to look for a vase. Then a doctor stepped to the microphone and said whoever had the baby should remember that there was an open wound at the site of the umbilical cord. It should be kept clean and dressed with an antibacterial agent and a fresh bandage at least once a day. Well, I knew that. I had seen it for myself. In the medicine chest, I'd found the polysporin I had once bought for a cut on my forehead, and I applied it only after I washed my hands. I'm not stupid. The doctor said the baby should have only sponge baths until the wound healed. I would have figured that out, too. A reporter asked if a ransom note had been received. That really got me riled. Of course not, you moron, I said. What do you think we are? No ransom note yet, Commissioner said. No ransom note as yet, which offended me even more. Then we were back in the studio with the handsome news anchor, and he said Mrs. Wilson, the mother, was under sedation, and he quoted Mr. Wilson, the father, as saying that they were not rich people. He was a CPA who worked for his living like everyone else. I had seen enough. I woke up Karen and hustled her and the baby and all the Kmart paraphernalia into the Durango. Why? Whatever is the matter, Lester? Whatever is the matter? She was still half asleep. Are we going somewhere? She looked frightened for a moment until I put baby Wilson in her arms. I ran back to the house and grabbed some clothes and things for each of us, and then I ran back again and turned off the lights and locked the door. I could imagine them any minute coming up the road and through the woods around us at the same time. We were in a cul-de-sac at the end of a dirt road here. I drove down to the 2-lane. It was a mile from there to the freeway ramp. I pointed east for Nevada, though not planning to go there necessarily, but just to be out on the highway, away from town, feeling safer on the move, even if expecting any moment to see a cop car in the rear view. I wasn't worried about Brenda. She would think twice before getting involved, but I reasoned that if the police were smart, they would talk to every florist in the city. Of course, there being Crenshaw's finest, it was only even odds that they would make the connection to an employee of Nature's Basket who had not shown up for work, one Karen Robileau, age 26. But even odds were not good enough as far as I was concerned, besides which the FBI was getting on the case, so say the odds were now 60-40. And if they made an ID of Karen, it would be too late for an anonymous return of the baby. And if they came knocking on the door before we had the chance to deliver him back of our own accord, as appeared likely, there would be no alleviating circumstances for a judge to consider that I could see. And so we were out of there. I had picked up her shoulder bag when running out of the house. Of course, it was of Indian design, knitted with all sorts of jagged lines and sectioned like a map in different colors of sand and rust and aqua. Inside, she kept not what women usually keep in their bags, no lipstick or powder compacts or portable tampon containers or any such normal things as that. She had some crumbs of dried flowers and a packet of Kleenex and her house keys and a paperback book about the Intergalactic Council, a kind of UN of advanced civilizations around the universe and how it was trying to send messages of peace to the earth. It was a non-fiction book, she told me. She had been thinking of becoming an Earth representative of the council, and 2 crumpled dollar bills and a handful of change. Karen, don't you have any money? Didn't you get paid this week? Oh, I forgot. Yes, Lester, let's see, she said, and rooted about in the pocket of her dress and handed me her pay envelope. She had her 120 in there, and I was carrying 35 in my wallet. Not great. I could cover gas, food, and a motel room for a night. After a couple of hours on the road, I was calming down. It occurred to me that despite everything, I wasn't mad at Karen. Given her state of mind, she couldn't be held responsible. If anyone, I was the one to blame for not springing into action the minute she walked in the door with the kid. And she was so trusting, sitting up there beside me with baby Wilson in her arms and her eyes on the road ahead. She didn't ask where we were going, not that I could have told her. And the moving car seemed to soothe him, too. He was quiet in her arms, a weird feeling, something like a pride of ownership came over me, which I would compare now to falling asleep at the wheel. My God, I woke up quickly enough. By now it had gotten dark. It was all desert now, the road flat and straight. Karen opened her window and leaned out to see the stars. I had to slow down so baby Wilson would not have a cold wind blowing into his face. I stuck my hand over the back of the seat and rummaged around till I found the package of diapers. I pulled one out and told her to put it around his little head. Babies don't get sick the first 3 months of their life, Karen said. No viruses or anything. They are automatically insured by God for 3 months exactly. Did you know that, Lester? But she did as I asked. And by midnight, I had us tucked away in a Days Inn outside of Doppel City, Nevada. So without consciously thinking about it, till we were practically there, this was where I had meant to come. I brought in a hamburger dinner, French fries, chicken wings, a milkshake, and for Karen, a garden salad. She never drank anything but water. I left her sitting on one of the double beds and feeding the child. I went outside for a smoke, and then I got back in the SUV. I knew Doppel. It was a city in its dreams only. What, a railroad yard, a string of car dealerships. It wasn't much of anything. Anyone could find the strip by seeing where the night sky was lit up. I decided on Fortunatos. The lady dealers with their little black bow ties and white shirts and black vests and ass-tight slacks with the one bit of class. Bells ringing, someone singing with a karaoke, and the usual din of losers. A cheap mob place trying to be Vegas, with an understocked bar and slots from yesteryear. It smelled, too, like there was a stable or a cow barn out back. In the men's room, where the floor was all wet and some drunk had lost it, I carefully combed my hair. Then I went out and sat down at a $5 table that looked about right and bought $50 in chips. Little blonde lady dealer, a pit man just behind her. 4 decks in the shoe. But my system is not counting cards. My system is betting modestly while sitting next to a high roller with a big stack in front of him, kind who talks too much and swivels around with each winning hand to see if he's gathered the audience he deserves. I didn't look at the dealer, but smiled as if to myself every now and then. I was very quiet. When I doubled, if the pit man had moved on, I put down a chip for her. She didn't look at me, but nodded slightly and smiled as if to herself. Tiny mouth, but well-shaped. There arose a sympathy between us. It's not as if any cheating goes on. It's more like a flirtation through the cards. Things happen. At the end of a half hour, it was as if she'd taken the edge of her plump little hand and cut one of the high roller's stacks and slid it over to me. I got up at that point. It was supposed to be a fun thing, nothing to take too far. That would lack class, ruin the whole game between us. I left 20 for her and cashed in for $125 net. It was a short drive to the Mexican part of town. Dark there, quiet, not many lights. I parked into the curb, rolled down the window, and sat there and had a smoke, and pretty soon a kid came along. He couldn't have been more than 13 or 14, and he peered in at me for a good look. When I told him what I was buying, he went to the front of my car and looked at the California plate. Then he went around a corner, and a few minutes later, someone who could have been his mother was standing at my window. She was a heavy-set woman with a handsome, broad face and a black dress too tight for her, but she acted tired or fed up. She wanted $150 for a 6-pack, which was cheap enough, but I told her as honestly as I could I had only $1.25 to spend. She said something in Spanish indicating her disgust, but then she nodded, and I drove away with 2 Visas, 2 MasterCards, and 2 Amexes, one of them gold. What was I up to, if not executive decisions? I felt almost proud of myself by the time I got back to the motel. Karen was asleep with her arm around the infant. Her shift had ridden up. She was weird and maybe even a witch of some sort, but those were the smoothest young legs and artfully draped crescents of backside a man could ever hope to gaze upon. But I was tired, too, and decided to wait till morning. I conformed one of my driver's licenses, practiced my signature, and then went to sleep in the other bed, thinking what a great country this is. Of course, the infernal problem remained, whatever the stupid mood I happened to be in. How was I going to get little Junior away from Karen without making her crazier than she was? And if I managed that, how to avoid the law while finding a way to deliver him to his proper parents? And thirdly, how to keep Karen out of a U.S. District Court as well as the newspapers as an object of public odium, to say nothing of myself. And then in the morning, wouldn't you know it, she was so busy with the baby that she didn't have time for me, or inclination. Everything was Jesu this and Jesu that, all her love flowing out of her and none of it coming in my direction. She sent me off for some more supplies, so careless of my feelings, she didn't even find it necessary to explain that the baby was taking all her weakened strength, as if she was a real mother recovering from the act of giving birth. She just expected me to understand that from the way she moved about, holding her hand in the small of her back for a moment of thought, or blowing back from the corner of her mouth a strand of hair that had fallen over her eye because both her hands were busy diapering the kid, and so on. It is strange how different the same woman can be at different times. Even a lovesick, crazy one like this, who was so moony about me from the first moment I caught her attention when I walked into Nature's Basket to wire flowers to Illinois for my mother's birthday. There was this lovely girl in a long dress and barefooted who seemed to have risen out of the smell of earth and the heavy humidity you get in the florists. Karen looked at me as if struck dumb. She tucked her hair behind her ears and said it was nice that I had a mother I thought so well of. I didn't tell her otherwise. I went along with her illusion, whereas the $25 I laid down for the mixed bouquet was an investment against a return of 10 times or 20 times that which I hope to wheedle out of the old bat after a decent interval. So after I get back with donuts and coffee and a yogurt for Karen, and this and that from the drugstore, It starts to rain in Doppel City, lightning and thunder, an unlikely spring torrent, and what does she do but take Baby Wilson outside behind the Days Inn, where she steps over the scraggly attempt at landscaping and walks out into the desert dirt, laughing and hugging the poor child and holding her head up to drink rainwater while not listening to what I am saying and shaking me off when I try to hustle her back inside. And as suddenly as it came, the rain passes, and Karen is standing there with her hair wet, as if she had just had a shower. And she says, "Look, my sweet baby, you see what God is doing?" And to me she says, "You too, Lester. Wait for the runoff where the rivulets leave their traces. Keep your eyes focused. It is pure magic of the desert that you're about to see." And all she meant was those desert wildflowers that hurry to blossom from the least encouragement of rain, which they did. Little settlements of blue and yellow and white spikes and petals and tiny cups in the declivities clustered close to the land as if not wanting to take the chance of growing up too far away from it. Flowers that you don't actually see opening, but just have the feeling that they were there all along, only you didn't happen to notice them before. And that was pretty if you go for that sort of thing. But the child still couldn't see, although he seemed to be peering out from under her hand, which she held over his head like an umbrella. And for a moment I had the ridiculous feeling of real communication between them, this mad girl and a stolen infant just 2 or 3 days old, who were now poking about together under the sun, out there in the flowering desert behind the Days Inn. I left them there and got the keys to the Durango and took it down the highway to a used car place. I wanted to get out of Doppel City as soon as possible. My theory was to keep moving, if nothing else. I didn't want to pay for another motel room. The Durango was registered in both our names, although in truth it was Karen's savings that had bought it, but under my influence, I might add, since I had always held Durangos in high esteem. It was already used when we bought it, though in reasonable condition with just 50,000 miles on the odometer, which I had since added 20 to. But the front tires were almost new, which is what I explained to the guy at the car lot, uselessly since he would only give me $750 for it, $6 if I wanted cash. I took the $600. He was a short, fat, underhanded thief in a white shirt and string tie, but then again he didn't ask too many questions as he unscrewed my plates and handed them to me. His man gave me a ride down the road to the Southwest car rental, and I used my Amex Gold to secure a new Windstar van whose greatest, if not only attribute, was a Nevada license plate. It was in this sad, shining new van that I wouldn't ordinarily be caught dead in that I packed up my imitation wife and child and headed west back to California. I had no idea what to do, but we were well disguised in our domestic vehicle with a little baby boy adorably asleep in the new car chair I had gotten him, and Karen stroked the upholstery and she marveled at the drink containers at each seat. She accepted the Windstar without question as she did any mysterious moves on my part. My feeling about things began to change. I had cash in my pocket and now some pride in my heart because Karen loved the new car. She turned the radio on, and there we were, heading west with the sun behind us and the great Patsy Cline singing Sweet Dreams of You, Karen giving me a sly, amused, and weirdly sane glance that caused me nearly to swerve into the opposite lane as we sang along with Patsy, "I know I should hate you the whole night through instead of having sweet dreams of you." Now, I do admit, there came over me an idea I not only hadn't considered, but that wouldn't have come even glancingly to my mind before this moment, which was to let it all hang out, to embrace my mad girl's madness as before all this happened I had customarily embraced her. Why not? Baby Wilson already had a certain character that I found agreeable. He cried only when he had to and seemed thoughtful most of the time, full of serious attention to the new world in which he found himself, as if seeing it only as a blur, he was by way of compensation listening very carefully. And though Karen told me that what I thought was a smile as he looked at me was in reality a bit of indigestion, it was hard for me not to smile back. She was an instant mother who seemed to have the wise love that mothers have as soon as they become mothers, as if the maternal hormones or whatever chemicals are involved had begun to operate within her from the moment she calmly walked out of that hospital with some other woman's child in her arms. I didn't know anything about the Wilsons except that Mr. Wilson was an accountant, which didn't foretell a particularly exciting life for this kid, who had already seen a not yet a week old 2 states and a rare rain in the desert that not many people not living in the desert would ever see. And his beautiful, though self-appointed and by law criminally insane mother had picked one tiny blue flower and put its stem in his little hand, and his fingers had curled around it, automatically, of course, but he still clutched it, though fast asleep in his car chair as we crossed the state line into California. And from all of this, and the sun lighting our way ahead like a golden road, I had this revelation of a new life for myself, a life I had never thought of aspiring to, where I would be someone's husband and someone else's father, dependable, holding a full-time job, and building a respectable place in the world for himself and his family, so that when he died, they would mourn grievously and bless his departing spirit for the love and meaningful life he had given them. A special news bulletin on the radio was like cold water on my face. Baby Wilson's parents had received a ransom note. We were about 100 miles east of Crenshaw. I pulled over to the side of the road. The details of the note had not been divulged, but it was believed the Wilsons intended to meet the kidnappers' demands. God damn! What, Lester? Can you believe this? I pounded the wheel. The baby woke and began to cry, and Karen reached back and unbuckled him and lifted him over the seat and held him in her arms as if to protect him from me. Lester, you're frightening us. Can you believe the evil in this world? That some slime would con those poor people to cash in on their suffering? She was silent for a moment. She said, I do believe there's evil in this world, yes, but I believe people can be redeemed. Her voice clouded up. She could barely finish the sentence. She began rocking the kid in her arms, and soon the tears were coming, and now I had the 2 of them bawling away. I got out of the van and lit a cigarette and paced up and down the grass shoulder. A car sped by, and its wind made the van shudder. Then another. I wanted to be in one of those cars. There was some sort of green crop growing in bunches low to the ground behind the fence, and it seemed to go on for miles. I wanted to be the farmer out here in the middle of nowhere, quietly growing his cash crop of whatever it was, spinach or cauliflower or some other damn inedible vegetable. I wanted to be anyone but who I was and anywhere but where I was. What was I supposed to do now? I motioned for her to roll down her window. Has it occurred to you, Karen, that you have provided him or them the opportunity? Gone were all my diplomatic strategies. All the anger I had pent up cascaded over this sad, pathetic girl sitting, rocking the baby in her arms, and her pale eyes reddened and enlarged with the tears rolling down her cheeks. Yes, you have stirred up something really grand, you know that? You have inspired others to do evil, Karen Robideau, and not only this slime or slimes. Supposing he really had possession of the baby, is it in the baby's interest of safety to have the news broadcast all around the country that there is a ransom note? Of course not. How could this slimeball trust them now, these poor parents, thinking they had told everyone about his private communication? What would you do under the circumstances if you couldn't trust the parents to deal without calling in the cops, the FBI, and the media? I mean, this is a goddamn radio station in Los Angeles. Los Angeles. They don't give a shit if the baby turns up dead. They just want people to listen so they can sell their advertising. They are happy to violate such delicate confidences. They are proud to be good reporters. So the evil is going out in all directions, Karen, like radio waves from an antenna. He can't do anything bad to this baby, she sobbed. None of them can. He doesn't have this baby. I have this baby, she said, kissing the child fervently on the cheeks, on his head, every part of him that was not swaddled. Well, maybe not, I said, quieter now, but how do the Wilsons know that? He's already done something to them when they find out he's a fraud and a hoax, and they are, who knows how many thousands of dollars poorer. And not only that, I said more to myself than to her, everyone thinks now you have an accomplice, a male accomplice, because no woman alone who stole a child would do it for purposes of ransom. Karen opened the door and stepped out of the van and handed me baby Wilson, and then went off a ways on the shoulder behind a tree and lifted her dress and squatted down to pee. I had not held him before to any extent. He was a warm little fellow. I could feel his heart beat. And he squirmed around a bit, trying to look at me who was holding him, and he had stopped crying. When Karen came back, she took baby Wilson and got in the van and sat there frowning and staring straight ahead, and she wasn't crying anymore either. It was like she was waiting for the car to move, as if it really didn't need a driver to get up there beside her and put the key in the ignition. A few miles on, at the edge of town, I pulled into a gas station with a convenience store. I bought us bottled waters and presented one to Karen by way of a peace offering. Without looking at me, she took it. I brought the newspapers they carried, the local and LA and San Diego papers. They all had the story. They were blissed out with excitement, and every story came with a composite police drawing of someone who looked like Karen, though with her ears grown bigger and her mouth thinner and her eyes transplanted from someone else. It was both not a good likeness and too close for comfort. I tossed the papers away. I didn't feel the need to show her anything more by way of persuasion. She had no voice in the matter as far as I was concerned. We drove on, and this turned out to be a well-groomed little town with big trees shading the streets and the retail stores uniformly in good taste, so as not to offend the eye. And there was nobody in sight, as if the townsfolk were having their afternoon nap, even the police. It hit me then. My idea. If the story was in every paper, if it was all over the damn state, did it matter where we dropped off baby Wilson? And I thought, why not here? And if not now, when? I peered right and left as I rolled to a stop at each corner until I saw something along the lines of what I wanted. A neat white stucco church with a red barrel tile roof. It was a Catholic church, as uniformly tasteful as everything else in this town. It had a Christ on the cross in relief on the stucco steeple. I can't now remember the saintly name of it. Even the town's name escapes me. This was a moment of such stressful fatedness that the surroundings remain in my mind only as bodily impressions. I remember the sun on my neck as I carried the car seat by its handles as a portable carry-all for the baby after Karen had been in there a few minutes. I remember my instructions to her beforehand as we sat in the van with the motor running in the neatly ruled empty parking lot around the side. And though the air conditioning was on, I felt the sweat dripping down the small of my back. It was very peculiar that she seemed as ready as I was, as if somewhere at some moment, I couldn't have told you when, we had made magnetic contact, as if it had never been otherwise than that we were both the sane and synchronized in our thoughts. So I experienced something also like a feeling of estrangement as I realized looking at her that I loved Karen Robelow. I loved her. I mean, it just came over me, an incredible, welcoming rush of gladness that welled up in my throat and threatened to spill out of my eyes. I loved her. Her frail being was strong. Her kookiness was mystical. And it was even eerier to hear in my mind at last what she had been telling me time and time again before all this happened, how she adored me, how she actually did love me in all the ways that people understand as love. It was a bonding that was true if it was this scary. Of course, I said nothing and did not declare myself. I really didn't have to. She knew. Our intimacy was in the fact of our conspiring together as she concentrated on what I was saying with her pale wolf eyes staring into mine, so much so that when she got out of the car and walked up the steps into the church, I wondered if this hadn't really been her plan and that she had brought me to this moment as I believed I had brought her. Because I remember her only problem was technical, whereas you might have expected much more in the way of resistance. Lester, she said, I don't know the right words for confessing. It's okay, I said. Just go in there and sit down in that box they have. It's somewhere off to the side. You don't have to be Catholic for them to listen to you. When he hears you, the priest will sit down on the other side, and you just tell him you want to confess something. And he will listen and never betray your trust that it is just between the two of you. And you don't have to cross yourself or anything. He will tell you what to do if you put it in the form of asking for his advice. And you will thank him, and you will mean it, and maybe thank God, too, that there are people who are sworn to do this for a living. And what will he say? Well, I have to believe priests read the papers and watch the TV like everyone else. So he will know what baby you are talking about. He will say, and where is the Wilson baby now? And you will tell him, Father, the baby is here. You will find him in his carryall just inside the front door, and a paper sack with his formula and his diapers, and a tube of polysporin for his belly button. And when he gets up and runs down the aisle, you slip out the side door to right here where we are parked. Karen is a brave woman. She has always been brave, and never more than at this moment. She walked in there with her skirts swaying from her lovely hips, and her hair, which she had tied up in a ponytail, given the solemnity of the occasion, also swinging from side to side, and for the same reason her usually bare feet were in a pair of sandals. But before she took her deep breath and stepped down from the windstar, she held the baby in her arms and caressed his round little head and brushed his dark hairs with the tips of her fingers as he stared up at her in his impassive manner and then looked away. And then Karen slipped him gently into my arms like a friend of the mother's who has been given the privilege for just that moment of holding another woman's child. That whole day, as we drove, she slept in the back seat, curled up with her hands under her chin. I had decided to head north, staying off the freeways for the most part. When it was evening, I pulled into a motel, and she went right from the car to the bed, where she got under the covers and went immediately back to sleep. I didn't want to take any chance that she would wake up and watch the TV, so I pulled the plug and bent it out of shape before I went to the restaurant they had there and watched as on the bar TV, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson were shown hugging their baby and laughing through their tears. They were not the youngest of couples. They were both on the portly side. And, in fact, Mr. Wilson had quite a paunch on him to make me think I would never let myself go that way. And it turned out that they had 6 other children of various sizes standing around the couch looking at the camera with what I recognized as the same unsmiling quietness of expression as baby Wilson himself. Meanwhile, an announcer was telling the story of the return and quoting Mr. Wilson saying he and his wife were so happy that they forgave whoever had kidnapped their child. But before I could breathe a sigh of relief, the camera cut to the FBI man now in charge of the investigation, who said that the FBI would continue the search, that regardless of the outcome, a federal crime had been committed, and it was never up to the Wilsons to decide whether or not to prosecute. And then another shot of the bad drawing of Karen. In the gift shop there, I bought a pair of sunglasses and an Angels baseball cap, and we got up at dawn and drove away. Karen wore the glasses and that cap with her hair tucked up inside all the way through California. I used the credit card sparingly, each one never more than once or twice until the last one, which I used a few times, and then threw away, not wanting to press my luck. And now we were down to our diminishing cash funds. In San Francisco, I parked Karen in a movie theater and went around to Noe Street to see if Fran still lived there. She did. When she opened the door, Fran said, "Well, will you look what the cat dragged in?" Fran was never the sort to bear a grudge. She was a song stylist who made her living singing in clubs. I visited with her for almost the whole 2 hours of a feature movie, and then she walked with me to the ATM at the local grocery. And as I left, I swore I would return her generosity in full. I knew she didn't believe me because she gave a good-hearted laugh and said time would tell, and she was smiling and shaking her head as I waved and turned the corner. Just before the Oregon state line, I removed the Nevada plates from the Windstar and replaced them with the Durango's old California plates. In Seattle, we took the ferry to Canada, standing at the rail in the gray and green mist of that day, with the foghorns coming over the water and the smell of sea, and gulls appearing and disappearing in the bad visibility. And Karen loved this part of the trip. There was a new peace between us, and she held my arm with both her hands with a kind of fervent wifeliness. And at the hotel in Vancouver, we resumed our lovemaking as in our first days together, and it was action-packed. She had really come awake to life, as I realize now, reflecting on the last months between us when she was more withdrawn than I wanted to admit. Vancouver is a squeaky clean town like all of Canada that I've ever seen. The glass office buildings reflecting the sky color and the downtown without litter of any kind, and everyone going about their business so as not to disturb anyone else. Not a town you would want to stay in very long. But you find things if you look, and I found a man in the import-export business who would take the Windstar off my hands, and if he gave me $3,000 American for it, I knew he would clear at least 10 at the other end. And then I bought Karen an opal engagement ring and a gold wedding band for 1,000 Canadian, though we didn't actually legally marry until we settled in this town in Alaska, where she's known not as Karen Robilow, but as Mrs. Lester Romanowski, although she doesn't get around enough to be known very well in her condition, but stays in this hillside cabin we rent and tends her garden and cooks good things, not only for me but for herself, since she is eating for two, while I am working down below at sea level between the mountains and the waterside, which is where this town is crammed. I have different jobs, one scrubbing pots and pans in this phony frontier restaurant where the monster hamburger menu is up on blackboards and the bartender has a red beard and wears a lumberjack shirt with the sleeves rolled. I also drive a school bus in the early morning and mid-afternoon, and another job when I have to is the slime line, which is how they handle the fish off the boats. A heavy-hauling, slippery job requiring rubber apron and gloves and hip boots and a shower and a good deodorant at the end of the shift. Just now I have a new opportunity on the weekend, and it's easy enough. I put on a funny bear costume and meet the cruise ship passengers as they come down the gangway. I do it because A, nobody knows it's me in that stupid outfit, and B, it gives me a chance to get close to those ships without drawing attention to myself. I dance the ladies around a bit and make them laugh and pose with them for a photo to record their historic visit to Alaska. Most people living here don't quite fit into the greater U.S. for one reason or another, so nobody asks too many questions. Everyone I've met mostly has an attitude of big plans for themselves, which I certainly can appreciate. I'm beginning to think my big plan must have something to do with those cruise ships. They sail up every day to rest their block-long hulls against the dockside, and when the tourists pour down the gangways, well, this plus the fish is what keeps the panhandle in the money. But more of the money stays aboard at the gaming tables. So I'm thinking, I find a way to get a passenger ID, take an overnight cruise to the next landing, come back flush the next day. I don't know, the modus is there, and it is only a matter of time till it makes itself known to me. Karen hugs me when I come home and always has a good dinner waiting and sits across the table with her chin in her hand and stares at me as I eat. Of course, she praises the reformed man I have become, and as a person who has not been without bold ideas of her own, she can appreciate that I am alert and ready for inspiration. But basically, she has no mind for anything but the baby growing inside her. She has a wise, contented smile these days, my young wife. No one meeting her for the first time would think she was anything but sane. She said last night that she hopes I don't mind not being consulted, but she got used to the name Jesu, and so that is what he will be called. Thank you.
Pausing here to see if Mr. Doctorow will answer some questions. I think he's returning to the podium.
I'm prepared to answer any questions as long as they're easy. Why do I write? Is that?
Last night I spoke to my father. He's an 84-year-old man. And I said to him, Dad, I'm at this writing conference, and tomorrow night I'm going to hear E.L. Doctorow. And he said, yeah, E.L. Doctorow. I remember him. He wrote for Bonanza. Did you write for Bonanza or anybody in your family so I can tell my father and he can be proud of me?
Would anyone like to answer that question? No, I'm sorry to disappoint you.
Edgar, when you start down this enthralling road, and you could tell by our silence how enthralling it was, do you have any idea where you're going?
You mean in this particular story
Yeah,
or
this
in
guy's
life?
No. Did you ever write for Bonanza, really, is my question. No, every detail, every moment, every change of direction, every decision and redecision, all this amazing panoply of activities and change of place, and we follow it. You know, we're with you every step of the way. This is a reflection of my amazement. Do you know where you're going?
No, well, you write to find out what it is you're writing. You start with some sort of image in your mind or situation, and you just see what happens. It's sometimes with stories, though, they come to you whole, but certainly with novels, never. That you begin with an image or some feeling, the vaguest thing, the smallest thing, and then you sort of pick at it, and sometimes turns into a book. With Loon Lake, for instance, it was just those two words that I saw on a sign in the Adirondacks that turned me on. We were driving up there, and it was silly, and I liked the sound of those words together. So I didn't know why they were so evocative. I'd spent some time up there in the Adirondacks as a child, and when I got home, I just started to think about the Adirondacks and that it had been a sort of playground for the very wealthy at the turn of the century in the 1920s, and one thing led to another, and that's how that book got written. But just from those two words, and of course, as I've told a million times with Ragtime, it was that we lived in a house built in 1906, and I had finished the book of Daniel and sat around for a year not realizing I was depleted by that book, trying to write, not being able to write anything. So I had a study up on the third floor of this house, and I was staring at the wall, so I started to write about the wall. And that's the kind of day you have sometimes, writer. And then the house was attached to in the period of time, and Teddy Roosevelt was president, and there was no air conditioning, and people wore white in the summer, and the women carried parasols, and there were trolley cars going down the bottom of the Broadview Avenue Hill, and I was off the wall and into the book. So that's the way it goes, and to a certain extent, these stories I've been writing lately, too, begin something no more substantial than the voice that you have in your head, and the voice for this one was Lester, who was the first thing we know about him, and the first thing I knew about him was that although it was 12 noon, he went in to put on his jeans and his shirt and comb his hair and have a beer for breakfast. And at that moment, I had him. But that's the way it works. You write your way into whatever it is you're going to discover.
Did you set out to be a writer? How did it happen that you started?
That's a very good question. Did I set out to be a writer? Well, certain things conspired to make me writer. One was that I was named after Edgar Allan Poe. There's always an injunctive quality to a name. There's some sort of names, parents bestow names on children with some expectation that something will happen. I don't know what my father thought at the time. It was his idea. He was crazy about Edgar Allan Poe. Actually, he liked a lot of bad writers. He liked James Fenimore Cooper, too, but I'm consoled that Poe is our greatest bad writer. And so that was one thing. And when I started to write, they, of course, were imitation Edgar Allan Poe stories. It took place in dungeons and cells and things. The cell was dark and dank. That was the way one of my early stories began. So that was part of it. But also I was fortunate enough, though, growing up in the Depression, to be surrounded by books and by very literate parents. We didn't have any money, but there were a lot of books and a lot of music in the house. My mother was a very fine pianist. My father had a little record shop down at the old Hippodrome Theater on 43rd Street and 6th Avenue. And he had, we always had music, and they were always bringing books and journals and newspapers into the house. And so I had what was now we know is an enriched childhood, but I didn't know it was that. We didn't call it that, and we just called it life. And I read everything I could get my hands on, and either what I found in the house or in the public library. And when I was about 9, I decided I was going to be a writer, that I was a writer. And for many years, I didn't even feel it was necessary to write anything to prove that I was. And then here's another story I've told a few times, that I found myself at the Bronx High School Science, where I really shouldn't have been. It was surrounded by insufferable boys, some of whom went around predicting quite correctly, as it turned out, that they would win the Nobel Prize in physics and chemistry. So that was a rough thing, so I gravitated down to the literary magazine, which was called Dynamo. And that was helpful for a while. And then I took a journalism class, just because I could write. And they taught all the usual stuff, who, what, why, where, and when. And none of that interested me. But then we were asked as an assignment to give an interview. I think I told Roger this story once before. And I really worked on that interview. I was industrious and excited, and I turned in the interview that I did with a stage doorman at Carnegie Hall named Carl. And he was a Jewish refugee, and all the performers came, the recitals loved him, and he would bring his lunch in a paper bag and a thermos of tea and sit in the back there and drink the tea through a cube of sugar he held between his teeth, which is the old style of tea drinking in Europe. And he'd lost all of his family, but he was a terrific guy with spirit, and he wore mismatching blue jacket and brown pants, and all the artists loved him, Rubinstein, Horowitz, and Jascha Heifetz, Toscanini. They were all crazy about Carl, the stage doorman. So the teacher called me up and said, in all the years I've been teaching the class, this is the best interview that I've ever seen. It's so good I want to put it in the school paper. I want to send one of the photography kids down to Carnegie Hall with you to take Carl's picture, to go with the story. And I said, I don't think we can do that. And she said, why? I said, well, Carl is very shy. So she said, what do you mean he's shy? He talked to you, didn't he? I said, well, not exactly. There is no Carl. I made him up, I said. So neither teacher or I realized what a momentous moment, what a portent that was. And I accepted her judgment, which was an F, and didn't think anything about it. But if I were confronted by her questioning today, I would say I was only doing what journalists have always done. Anyway, so from these odd scrapes, I got myself into real trouble and became a writer.
But for example, you use the phrase six-pack.
I'm sorry?
Six-pack. I thought you were talking about a six-pack of beer. You were talking about
Yeah.
a six-pack
Well, you were
of
supposed to
stolen
think it was a
cars.
six-pack of beer, yeah.
Well, how did you know about that?
I made it up. That's how you learn about everything.
Are there any new Carls in your life? Is there something you're working on now that you care to tell us about?
Eddie Carl's in my life? Not that I know. I must have been put him together from what was in the air in those days. And what I'm working on now is is another novel, and in about another 2 or 3 months, I'll be able to figure out what it is.
When you start a story, you say you hear a voice. Are you ever surprised, or do you find that the voice at the end of the story is perhaps different than the one you heard to begin with?
Am I ever surprised? What?
When you start a story such as Loon Lake, you said you hear a voice that tells you how to start the story. Do you ever find that when you complete a story, you complete a novel, that the voice at the end is different than the voice you heard originally?
Do I misunderstand you suggesting that the voice changes on you as you work? Is that it?
Or maybe that when you originally hear the voice, do you kind of know where the character is going to end up, or do you find yourself surprised by where the character ends up?
It becomes a matter of hearing it accurately. A voice is constructed of several things. It's all words on paper. It's constructed of syntax. It's constructed of degrees of grammar that might be correct or incorrect. It's constructed of diction, of the words that are chosen by the first-person narrator. All those things and a few others give you the voice. Though you don't know it when you're working, you shouldn't think about it that carefully. It's a concoction of various uses of language that coalesce into a sound that gives you a sense of a personality. And it can get pretty complicated. Of course, you can write in the third person, too, and assume the authorial voice, or you can write in an intimate kind of third person that identifies very closely with one character, so it's kind of a pseudo-third. Shares third and first person qualities. But you hear haven't you been hearing all this stuff in your workshops this week?
I guess to clarify a little better, do you find that when you start out a work, do you know where it's going to go, or are you kind of surprised when you reach the end of something about where you've gone, where you've come from?
Well, you do revise. I mean, it's not all inspiration. Eventually, your editorial intellect takes over, and you realize that you've made some commitments, that you've established some premises that you have to make good on. And so the problem in revision is to make sure you do that. And the problem also becomes in knowing when you've strayed off the nerve of your piece, when you've maybe lost the voice or a bit, and you have to patch it up. So it's not errorless, flawless work. I mean, if it was, we'd all write masterpieces every time out. It does take effort. Hard work. Writing every day. Going to work like everybody else. And making the lives of the people around you as miserable as you possibly can. Yes.
I'd just like to know. Thanks. My dad's also from the Bronx, and I just wanted to know what your favorite memory of growing up in the Bronx was, and if it might have been anywhere near Grand Concourse area where he was, and what your favorite memory of that growing up was.
We have another author from the Bronx here.
I'm not from. My dad.
Oh, you're not?
My dad. Well, I mean, I went there a lot to visit, but.
Well, you know, all the best writers come from the Bronx.
My dad wrote my birth certificate.
I mean, Brooklyn gets all the press, but if you think about it.
Just your favorite memory of that.
Herman Melville's buried in the Bronx. You know, that says something, doesn't it? I use my own life in one book, World's Fair, and two things to say about that. One is that no matter what your material is, you have to make the composition. So whether you do research or whether you hear a conversation, get inspired, or whether you use the materials of pictures you see, or whether you use the materials of your own life, you have to be as objective about these materials as any other kind of materials for your book. And you need to make the composition, you need to make it work. And if something happened on a Thursday, that doesn't mean it has to happen on a Thursday in your book. And if the lead character has 7 brothers and 18 sisters, you can get by with 2 or 3, that kind of thing. And so in World's Fair, I did that. And to what degree it's autobiography and what degree it's fiction, I don't know anymore. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that once you do use these materials, they're really gone in the ordinary sense of living in your memory, the way memories usually live that are important. Once you write them down and exploit them for the purposes of a book, there's a certain kind of expansive being that occurs, and they're never quite the same and quite as vivid and as strong and as meaningful to you after that. I hope I'm not ruining your evening by telling you that.
No, it's been very nice.
But, you know, writing is not just a matter of setting words artfully down on paper. You expend yourself, and if you do it long enough, there's a lack of self-recognition in you. And all writers will tell you this, who've been around for a while, that they may look and sound like they always have, but as Margaret Atwood said about something else, where is here? You know, I'm not sure anymore.
Is Baby Wilson going to be part of a larger work? I'm dying to know what comes next. It's riveting.
Well, thank you. No, I don't think Baby Wilson is going to be part of a longer book. It'd probably be a part of a collection of books. There's one thing about Baby Wilson, a couple of other things I've done lately, is that they're not classically constructed stories. If you were following this thing, if the classical short story you can read in Dubliners by James Joyce, they're built around epiphanies, revelations, and the entry point of the story is usually quite close to the climax or the denouement. But the people aren't writing that way anymore. We're sort of drifting back to the old tale-telling narratives, the sequential narratives that stretch out in time. And that seems to be the kind of story that suits me. But it may be that these stories are really not short stories at all, but just little novels, which is why you have that feeling.
I wonder if you'd talk for a minute about the translation or the conversion of your work to the screen from one form to another, and particularly how you felt about Ragtime.
I was hoping nobody would ask that question. Well, the film I thought was pretty close to being a disaster. And every director I've ever worked with, I have a theory about directors, and everyone I've ever worked with has had one disastrous idea, and the minute I've heard it, I knew the piece was doomed. And the director of this film had a theory about movies that they should be about one person. And if Ragtime is anything, it's not about one person. The minute I heard that, my heart sank. It's actually a pretty good film for about 15 minutes. Unfortunately, it goes on for about 2.5 hours. But it's not all the fault of a particular artist, because he's a wonderful director, Milos Forman. It has to do with the nature of film itself, which is very literal. Even if it's fantasy, even if it's comic fantasy, there's a presumption in all film that something you're seeing is actually happening. But when you set a piece to music, you see, you don't have that presumption, and you're not with that burden. If people go around singing about how they feel, you know we don't do that in real life. Or if sets come down from the flies, we know that doesn't happen in real life. And there's a kind of compaction in a stage work that we recognize implicitly is not, we don't have to think of this as actually happening. So the people who set that book to music, and it's not a realistic book after all, it's kind of a mock historical chronicle, had an advantage over the filmmaker, because they didn't have to make you feel that this was anything but an object on the stage. And so I thought they were pretty good at it too. They didn't have the irony and the sort of the erotic mischief in the book. They lost that, but they kept pretty close to the major strands of the story. And I think there's some lovely music in it. And I was very pleased. They made one mistake, classic era, unforgivable. They didn't even ask me to do a walk-on. But other than that, they were pretty good. Well, what do you say we break up and go out and have a drink?
This concludes another of WLIU's live broadcast of the evening lecture series of the 2002 Southampton Writers' Conference from the Duke Lecture Hall at Southampton College. Our speaker tonight was Edgar Doctorow.